Topic of today's discussion is going to be, can atheism account for the preconditions of intelligibility? Tom and I have been having discussions back and forth for the past year. I know initially Tom reached out to me about having a discussion, and it's been prolonged because of COVID and just because I know there's not a lot of opportunity to get out with so much going on right now. So we're going to have a discussion today. It's going to be roughly about an hour. I've asked Steve to come on to make sure that we have a good order and discipline in the discussion. So from this point, I'll just turn it over to Steve because I know you have probably some preliminary points that you'd like to address.
Yeah, okay. Well, welcome, gentlemen. It's going to be a great discussion. It's going to be real simple today, though. It's going to be more just a discussion. What we're going to do, the ground rules are, going to be the topic being, can atheism account for the preconditions of intelligibility? Each of you gentlemen will have 5 minutes as to opening statement to state your case. Then we will have 25 minutes of cross-examination for each gentleman, where one will question the other, and you'll answer questions back, and then we'll swap out. Real easy today. And Tom, you are taking the affirmative, so you will actually go first today, and then Sonny, you will follow up. Okay. And give me just a second here. Let me get a timer set for you guys, and we will be ready to roll. All right, Tom. Whenever you're ready, we can start this.
Sure. So to understand intelligibility, you only really need to understand one thing, which is that you exist. You start with the cogito ergo sum, as Descartes put it, which is, I think, therefore I am. And because I know I think, I know I exist, so I have knowledge. And from that, we can know certain things about reality, namely that it exists. Reality exists. Reality is reality. And from that, you get the laws of logic. A equals A. Reality is reality. Reality is not reality. That's the law of non-contradiction. And the law of excluded middle reality cannot be reality and not reality at the same time. So you can get all the laws of logic just as descriptions of reality from the fact that you exist. You don't need to know anything about the fundamental nature of reality. You don't need to know anything about what created the universe. All you need to know is from the fact that you exist, you can learn the preconditions of intelligibility from that alone. And then you can start making up reasons, well, what caused the universe? What caused all the way the universe could be as it is? You could say it's a god, or the spaghetti monster, or any number of things. There's infinitely many of them, and they can all account for the intelligibility of the universe. It's pretty easy to do. The problem is, well, how do you tell which one is right? And to do that, you need to show some way to differentiate your imagination from reality. And that's the tricky part. That's where we have to get into epistemology and the hard things in knowing about the universe, and that's where we get into science, because science is the confirmed way we have to differentiate imagination from reality. There may be other ways, don't know. I don't know of any particularly that work very well. I know science does work, and so that's the one I go with. And given science, we don't really know anything that exists other than material, physical things in the universe. Those are the only things that have been confirmed to exist. And so the only reasonable conclusion to make is that whatever the universe is fundamentally physical and material, just based off of induction. Other than that, we do our best to use this methodology to show that any ideas we have are imaginary or not. And so if we have a hypothesis like, well, what created the universe? Maybe it was a god, maybe it was the spaghetti monster, maybe it was an unknown natural force. We say, well, if my hypothesis is true, then we should be able to make testable predictions that if we see some result in the future, that will lean evidence towards my conclusion over the other hypotheses. And if we see those results, we get good evidence that one hypothesis is the real one and not one of the imaginary ones. And if you have no way to differentiate imagination from reality, then you have no evidence. And so just intuition and saying, well, I can imagine it to be the case and giving arguments are just essentially presenting how you can imagine things to be, but that doesn't give us a way to differentiate. Is your imagination telling us what is true about the world, or if it's just something in your imagination, which is why we need that extra evidence of things like science that can differentiate imagination from reality. So I go with the scientific method because it is the most reliable that we've ever discovered in human history, and there is no more reliable source of knowledge other than just the cogito, essentially. And that's how atheism grounds knowledge. We start with the cogito. I think, therefore I am. I exist. And then from that, we can create languages like logic and math to describe the existence we experience. We can say I exist, reality is reality, get the laws of logic, there is one reality, and get math. And that's all math and logic are. They're just languages that humans invented to describe reality. And then from that, we can say, well, there's some difference between the things I imagine and the things I experience. Like if I see a unicorn, but I can't touch it or feel it or anything. So it seems like there's some difference between the things in my head and the things I can experience. And we need some way to differentiate between those two, and that's science. And that using that methodology, we can get all of the justified beliefs in the consensus of every scientific field just fine, with no assumption of anything outside of the natural sciences or of science, materialism, physicalism. And that's how atheism can ground the preconditions of knowledge.
All right. Well, you've got another minute.
That's good. I'll give it up to the questions period.
All right. Then Sonny Hernandez, we will go to you now. You've got 5 minutes whenever you're ready.
Okay, let me just start out by saying, praise the Lord thy God, who created us and who sustains us and who governs the world and everything in it. Let me start out by saying that everything my opponent had stated in his opening does not prove that atheism can account for the preconditions of intelligibility. Everything my opponent just stated is several things, proves several things. Number one, he is suppressing the truth. Number two, he has no ultimate standard. Number three, he can't account for nothing unless he tries to borrow from the Christian worldview, but then denies the foundations and the principles by which they're derived. The other one is, I would argue that he's proving, just by showing up to this debate today, that his arguments are not only arbitrary, but they're also absurd. There's a reason today why my opponent uses illustrations of unicorns, and that's because his worldview is not based on fact. It's based on fiction. So there's no wonder when we see him use these illustrations of unicorns and all these imaginary, basically characters that you see typically from movies, because that's all his worldview can produce. Let me go on to say that I know many of your people are going to ask, well, how can you say there's no such thing as an atheist? Because there's not. There is absolutely no such thing as an atheist. So many people that are watching this may wonder, well, then how can you say there's no such thing as an atheist when you're actually debating one right now? No, I'm not debating an atheist. I'm debating somebody right now that is either superstitious, he's a liar, he's suppressing the truth, or he's somebody that obviously is getting paid to teach this nonsense. So let me just further on to say that everybody knows that God exists. I think the Bible is very clear that there is a danger of trusting in self-righteousness and not the Savior's righteousness. You see, I appeal to the God of the Bible and his gospel, which points to the electing and discriminative grace of God in the particular death and the perfect righteousness of Christ as my righteousness, as the means of my justification, where my opponent appeals to superstition and delusion and suppressing the truth. This is the danger of trusting in self-righteousness, but not the Savior's righteousness, because we know that God exists. The Bible is explicitly clear. Paul in Romans 1 did not say, knowing a God. It literally says, Theote nontes ton theon, uses the definite article, the God. So that's why I can't stand it today when I hear professing Christians say, well, I was once an atheist, but then I became a Christian. No, you were never an atheist, because there's no such thing as an atheist. So again, the Bible is very clear that God had indelibly engraved the works of his law and wrote it upon our hearts, so we know that God exists. We know what is right or wrong. We know that the light of nature and the works of God plainly declare that he is God. We know that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the Bible says only a fool says in their heart that there is no God. So the challenge today for my opponent is when he wants to get into topics of preconditions of intelligibility. I like to ask him, how do you account for these things? How do you account for metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, the laws of logic? How do you account for universals in a worldview which believes we basically exist based on dumb luck and chance? Again, that's the philosophical problem that my opponent is going to have today. He's going to have to be intellectually dishonest while simultaneously borrowing from my worldview, but then denying the foundation and the principles by which they're derived. And so my opponent can say all day long, he says, I think, therefore I am. But I tend to like what Jason Lyle said when he said, I am. God says, I am, therefore you think. So again, look forward to this discussion today. I want to turn it over to the moderator.
Okay. Well, y'all both finished your opening statements quick. So, Tom, you will have 25 minutes to question Sonny, and then we'll flip it around. So I am setting a clock now. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay, here we go.
So you said that my use of a unicorn shows that my worldview can't show real things. Is that what you said?
The point of referencing the unicorn is you keep using these frivolous illustrations and pointing to imaginary creatures to make points which it doesn't make any sense. The topic
Okay, so wait, stop. So my point was there's a difference between imaginary things and real things, and then I listed an imaginary thing. How is that pointless?
Well, again, I think the point that you have to get to is the topic.
No. I don't care about what you think. I made the point.
Well, no. You asked me a question. You asked me a question.
This is my question time. Sonny, my question time.
You asked me a question. I'm going to answer.
No. You went to a different question. So my question is I made a point. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between imagination and reality, and then I listed an imaginary thing. How is that pointless? That's literally
because you haven't defined what reality is. Your whole reality is nothing. Sonny,
that's your point. So my point was. There's a difference between imagination and reality. Mm-hmm. Then I listed an imaginary thing, which was a unicorn. And you said listing a unicorn somehow doesn't show my point. When again, my point was there's a difference between imaginary things and real things. Here is an imaginary thing. Where is the logical step?
The question is, if you ask me a question, give me an opportunity to respond. So if you ask me a question, I'm going to respond to you. My point is that the reference to the unicorn and your reality are really no different. They're both based on
so I gave a difference. So I literally said, I can imagine a unicorn, but I don't touch it or feel it, or there's no sensation there. So I literally gave a difference. So what you did is a straw man, because if you say there's no difference, and I literally give a difference, then you can't be representing what I said, because I literally said, here is a difference.
A straw man is a logical fallacy, but your worldview can't account for logic, and if you think you can, then please explain it.
Well, were you listening to my opening? Because I literally did in the opening.
No, you didn't. You begged the question, and you just rattled on with psychobabbling claptrap. There was nothing in there that remotely said anything about accounting for atheism, accounting for the preconditions of intelligibility.
So what about
reality
my opening
as if that's universally accepted your view of reality and mine?
What about my opening was begging the question?
Everything from the start to the finish. You say reality as if that's a universal agreed upon topic.
Which premise was in the conclusion?
Every single thing you said begged the question.
You need if you accuse me of a fallacy, you need to show me which premise was in the conclusion.
Okay. Basically, what I'm accusing you of as a fallacy is because you keep quoting reality as if that's a universal concept, like your view of reality and the Christian worldview of reality are both the same. They're not.
Sonny, what is begging the question?
You're assuming.
Like, is that what you think begging the question is? If I could Google the definition of begging the question, it's going to say assuming.
Begging the question means that you're assuming something to be true, but you haven't proven it.
That's not what begging the question means.
Well, take it how you want it. The topic of today's discussion is, can atheism account
so you
for the
don't know what
preconditions
begging
of
the question
intelligibility?
is that correct?
Sure. Hey, based on your worldview, you can change and define words all you want because your worldview can't account for the validity of strict principles.
No, that's again the straw man. So I'm going, what is the definition of begging the question in philosophy by the experts of everyone in theism and atheism?
I've already explained. So if you want to belabor the issue and keep asking me over and over again, maybe somehow you're going to find somebody that will agree with you. I've already explained to you. It means assuming, and you're not proving anything based on your assertions.
So no one in philosophy uses that. That's your made-up definition.
That's what your worldview does. You make up definitions because you can't account for the.
I didn't make up this definition. Philosophers did from like the beginning of time. So if you're making up a new definition here,
can we take this to the topic though of?
No, because he accused me of a fallacy.
Of intelligibility.
If he accused me of a fallacy, so I gave my justifications, and he accused me of a fallacy. So if he doesn't know what the fallacy is, I'm trying to figure out what his objection here is, because he doesn't know what a begging the question fallacy is. So he hasn't actually raised an objection to what I said. He's just accused me of something he doesn't know what it is. Said it's assuming something. Like nothing I said would assume anything. There were no assumptions in the definition I gave. So I don't even know what he thinks he means. But begging the question is when you use something as the basis to justify something else and then use that something else to justify the original basis. So A is B, They're because B is A. That's begging the question. If the second premise or the conclusion is true because of the first premise, and the first premise is true because the conclusion is true, that's begging the question. It's not assuming something without proving it. That's an assumption. That's not begging the question. I don't think he knows what these fallacies are. So he hasn't actually brought an objection to what I said. I said, I think, therefore I am. That's not an assumption. And I can then create a language to describe that, which is called logic. Reality is reality. A equals A. I
What's your
exist. I
question?
am me.
What's your question?
What? Well, essentially, nothing what you said made sense because the words you're using don't actually jive with how philosophers, theists who believe in God, and atheists, like just everyone in philosophy uses those words. So nothing you said was actually an objection to anything in my position. I didn't use assumptions. There was no begging the question because I don't think you know what that is. So I don't know how anything you said was even remotely
What's your
in
question?
the ballpark of what I said.
What's your question?
The same thing before. Do you know what a begging the question fallacy is?
Are you going to ask
Obviously
me
not.
that question again after you've already asked it 3 times?
Yes.
Okay.
So can you admit you don't know? Do you know?
I've already explained to you how I
So you
define
can't.
begging the
So-
question. If you want to
How-
waste your
how is
25
it?
minutes, have at it. I'm going to give you the same response every time.
Okay, so you can't admit that you don't know what begging the question
No,
is.
what I can't admit to is agreeing with what you're saying right now. I've already gave my explanation. Keep wasting your 25 minutes. That's up to you.
Yeah, so if you're ignorant of a topic and you cannot admit you are wrong about a simple thing after I just literally read you the definition from a philosophical journal, of a theistic philosophical journal, then I think that shows you're dishonest in the conversation. Like, you need to be honest in the conversation. You need to be able to be, when you're wrong, when you get something wrong that you don't know about, you need to be able to say, oh, I'm sorry I didn't know about that, or I got that wrong, to have an honest conversation. Like, if you're just going to blather on and not know the things you're talking about and give straw men and list fallacies that you don't even know what they mean, I mean, I don't know where to go from that conversation because you just don't know the topic. I mean, in saying I assume things when literally there were no assumptions, like, where's the assumption in cogito ergo sum? What is the assumption there?
Your assumption is because you haven't proven nothing. That's the whole concept.
No. That's where is the assumption in cogito ergo sum?
You tell me.
Well, you're the one making the claim, so I can't tell you what your claim is. I mean, I tried to understand what you meant by begging the question.
Here's the point that I'm trying to make. You make a lot of assumptions. The topic of today's discussion is, can atheism account for the
I just asked you
preconditions
what
of
are the
intelligibility?
assumptions, and you
Okay,
haven't told me any. You keep saying I'm making
something, okay?
assumptions. but
The
you haven't
topic
given an
is,
example
can
of it.
atheism account for the preconditions of intelligibility?
So, Sonny,
You're going
where
to
is the
have to
assumption?
justify how you're
Sonny,
able to do
Sonny,
that.
This is my question time.
Sure.
Where you said I have an assumption.
Sure.
Where is the assumption in my argument, cogito ergo sum? Where is the assumption?
Because merely quoting something doesn't make it true. You're going to have to justify it by appealing to the validity of strict principles.
I think, therefore I am.
Okay.
That's cogito ergo sum.
That's
Where is the assumption?
That's a soundbite quote. How does that prove something just by citing it?
So it's words that express something in the world. So I think that's a fact. I have this experience of thinking, therefore I exist, because I can't think I exist and be wrong.
I think you're missing the fundamental point. Merely quoting that doesn't prove that atheism can account for the preconditions of intelligibility. That's the point I'm trying to make.
I don't think you understand. It's just quoting it isn't the point. It's an argument. So how arguments work is you have a premise and you have a conclusion. Premise 1, I think. Premise 2, in order to think you must exist. Conclusion, I exist. Right? Where is the assumption in that?
Okay, here's the assumption. Okay, I'm going to say this one more time. The debate topic is, can atheism account for the preconditions of intelligibility by merely saying, I think, therefore I am? Are you implying that somehow means that you've just now proven the preconditions of intelligibility for atheism? I don't think so.
Where is the assumption? You didn't list an assumption anywhere in that. Where is the assumption?
Saying, I think, therefore I am. Oh, therefore atheism is proven to be true. Nice try. That doesn't work with me. That may work with some of these benighted people that give you money to
that wasn't
teach
my
your
argument.
nonsense.
So again,
that doesn't work with me.
So, Sonny, that wasn't my argument. I never said that. Like, you could go back and rewatch my intro.
What purpose of saying, I think, therefore I am? What does that have to do with the topic of today's discussion? Can atheism account for the preconditions of intelligibility? What does that have to do with it?
It's how you gain knowledge. You have to start from some groundwork to gain knowledge. And then from that, you build on that.
But that doesn't answer how you can account for the preconditions of intelligibility. You're assuming. You think just by saying something, therefore it's true.
Where is the assumption, Sonny? Where is the assumption in anything I said?
I've already said to you, merely saying something and arguing that somehow
Sonny. What is an
proves that
assumption?
atheism accounts for the preconditions proves absolutely nothing.
Sonny, what is an assumption? What is the definition of an assumption?
You're assuming something to be true that you haven't proven.
You can't use the word assuming. When
You are making propositions, and you're basically making an argument. And you think in that it's actually true when it's not. You see, like I said before, that may work with individuals that support your nonsense, but that doesn't work with me.
Okay.
You actually have to prove it.
What is your definition of assumption again?
I've already explained it. If you ask me 3 times, maybe you think that somehow my definition of it is going to change.
I didn't understand it. What did you say the definition of assumption is?
I said you make propositions, or you make a statement, or you assert something, and you're implying that it's somehow true when it's not.
You can't use the word assertion in the definition of assertion.
Well, I just did.
Assumption.
I don't base my worldview on what some professing atheist who suppresses the truth tells me what I need to do. I base it upon the word.
So again,
of God.
that's your dogma. You have this dogmatic belief that's not based on reason. I mean, you have a belief based off of a magical rib woman who was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree, and you're talking to me about how my worldview isn't based in reason.
Says the guy who believes that nothing becomes something which becomes everything.
Sonny, my time. This is my time. You'll have your time in a minute. So, and unicorns are actually brought up in the Bible, so I don't know why you think that's somehow strange for me to use them and then call it imaginary. You're calling your own worldview imaginary. Pretty hilarious. So an assumption is a thing that is accepted as true or certain to happen without proof. But what I accepted as certain or true was that I think, therefore I exist. So where is the assumption in that argument?
Because the topic of today's discussion is, can atheism account for the preconditions of intelligibility? For by saying, I think, therefore I am, doesn't prove that. That's the point.
That's not an assumption. So where is the assumption in my argument? Because my argument goes, I'll say it again for you. I think, therefore I am, so I exist. And if I exist, I can then make a language to describe things about the universe, like the laws of logic. Those come from I'm a language that humans made up to describe reality. Same with math, a language humans made up to describe reality. And so reality is reality. So we know reality is reality. That's where laws of logic and math come from. That's where the preconditions of intelligibility come from. Reality is reality.
You haven't defined reality, so that's the fundamental problem.
I don't need to define reality to account for the intelligibility.
You don't have to define reality. You don't think how ironic that you can't define reality. You're in a discussion on can atheism and account for the preconditions of intelligibility. Oh, but I can't account for reality. How funny.
I don't think
you're basically just arguing your position is arbitrary. And you have no standard to justify anything.
Gibberish. So again, to account for the intelligibility of knowledge, or the intelligibility, rationality of the world, or whatever you want to call it, all you need to know is that can the world produce intelligibility? If reality is reality, then yes, it can produce intelligibility. That's all you need to know. You don't need to know what it's made of. Like, reality could be all material and it can produce intelligibility. Reality could be purely idealistic and it can produce intelligibility. Reality could be dualistic and it can produce intelligibility. There are many different options that can account for the intelligibility. All you need for that is reality needs to be reality, which gives you the laws of logic. And
you don't find that circular? Reality just needs to be reality? Yeah, don't worry about stating a justification for how you even have reality. Oh, but just reality is reality.
Can I pause here for just a second, gentlemen? I'm going to interject here real quick. Tom, do you have any questions about Sonny's position on his position of today's topic? If we can move past, I think, therefore I am, and let's move closer to the topic of what is supposed to be discussed, because you only have 12 minutes left, and so do you want to
well, the question
serve him some questions based on his worldview, which he holds to a biblical worldview.
Well, again, the topic is, can atheism account for intelligibility, not can anything else. So, I mean, The topic is, I'm demonstrating, yes, I can account for intelligibility. So all you need for the intelligibility of the universe is, can reality have a consistent way of operating in such that it can produce intelligibility? And the answer is yes. The only thing it needs for that is reality needs to be reality. And I don't know. He said, how does reality come into existence? Reality has always existed. It's never not existed. Even in his worldview, reality has always existed because there was God.
I never said, how can reality come into existence? You're putting words into my mouth I never said. What I said was, how do you account for reality? How do you justify, what is your ultimate standard to justify what reality is in a worldview that believes we're just a chemical accident that happened by dumb luck some several billion years ago? So where do you get reality from in a worldview that can't account for the validity of strict principles? How can you account for those?
What do you think reality means?
You tell me. You're asking me a discussion. What you tell me?
Well, reality is everything that exists. So if God existed, God would be in reality too. So if you're saying, how do I account for reality? How do you account for God?
Well, are you asking me? Is that your question for me? How do I account for God?
How do you account
by
for
several
God?
ways. By general revelation, because God has revealed himself to us. Well, if you ask me a question, let me answer the question.
Sonny, I'm not asking how do you know of God. I'm asking how did God come into existence? What accounts for God's existence?
God is far above all distinctions of time, past, present, and future. He has no beginning and no end. He is eternal.
Right. That's exactly how atheists see reality. Reality is beyond space and time. It has no beginning, no end. It's reality.
Sure, but here's the philosophical problem for you is that I can account for God. You can't account for yours.
How do you account for God?
Very easily. By general revelation, by special revelation, because of the fact that our own Constitution evinces us of the fact that God's existence, and without God you can't know nothing. But in your worldview, you have to borrow from our worldview since you can't account for the laws of logic that you keep quoting so vehemently.
Sonny, what do you mean by account by? What do you think that means?
Okay, account for. In other words, I can justify logic, for existence, in the Christian worldview. I know that.
So, Sonny, I asked, how do you account for God?
I'm answering your question. You said, how can I account for God? I'm trying to answer, but you keep cutting me off.
Well, you answered about how do you account for logic. I want to know, how do you account for God?
That's where I'm getting to. I don't believe logic. I believe logic is an expression of God's eternal and unchanging divine character. I don't believe it's something God created.
Okay, so I didn't ask about logic. I asked about God. How do you account for God?
Okay, so now you're asking me, how do I account for God? And I've already explained it to you. Because of his invisible attributes, because of special revelation, because our own Constitution evinces us of this fact. In fact, we can't understand the world around us without God.
So when I hear the word account for, what I mean is like what created this thing? That's what account for means. Like when I say what accounts for that chair, someone created the chair. What accounts for logic, you say God created logic. So when you say something accounts for God, that seems to imply that something created God. I mean,
no, that's your definition. Account for something basically means that you're able to justify it, that there is an ultimate standard by which you appeal to that can account for all things. In other words, so for instance, I'll give you, if you wouldn't mind, let me give you a quick example. Let me use the laws of logic, for example. The laws of logic are not affected by time, space, matter, or people. They're not affected by time because they're invariant. They're not at all affected by matter because they're universal. It's not affected by people because the laws of logic are matchless. They are always true. And the Christian can count for that because God is not made of matter. God is always true. God is universal. You see, I can count for these things because this comes and derives itself from the Bible itself. Your worldview rejects these things, but yet you still try to use logic in a discussion with me, and again, knowing darn well you can't account for it.
Well, I just did. So account in philosophy, when normal people who are educated in the field use the term, means an account is an explanation of the terms and the underlying metaphysical elements. So it's explaining the parts of the thing. That's what you're doing. So if you're saying what accounts for God, you're like God is made of X, or what accounts for the chair, what made X. So what you seem to be doing is you're confusing the epistemology with the metaphysics.
No, I'm not. What I'm doing is I'm appealing to an ultimate standard by which all things derive. You're appealing to multiple standards,
you're interrupting.
which proves that your worldview is arbitrary.
Sonny, you're interrupting. So when you say, I can know about God through special revelation, that's epistemology. That's how you know something. But we're not talking about when you account for it, how you know it. We're talking about its ontology, which ontology is a subset of metaphysics. So we're saying, what accounts for God? What caused God to exist? And your response was, well, God has existed forever without unchanging outside of space and time. So if you can account for God, then I can account for reality, because I think reality has existed outside of space and time forever. So if you account for God, I can account for reality just fine.
No, that's a fallacy, and here's why that's a fallacy. Because I can account to the God of the Bible because my worldview can account for the preconditions of intelligibility, because that is where intelligibility derives itself from.
Which fallacy was that? You said there was a fallacy.
Hold on a minute. What you're doing
Sonny, question. I got a question.
What you're doing is that you're saying, because I have this belief, therefore you can have that belief.
Sonny, this is my question time.
My belief does not equate to yours as well.
Sonny, this is my question time. You said there was a fallacy there. I can prove it does equate. So you say you account for God because of he's existed outside of space-time. I account for reality because it exists outside of space-time forever. That's equivalent because I'm using the same explanation. So that means my worldview does equate to yours. So where is the fallacy in that? You said it was a fallacy. Which fallacy? Where's the fallacy?
Is because you just said, well, because that's how
Sonny,
you account for God. Well, that's how I account for atheism.
Which fallacy is that fallacy? Which fallacy?
It's a fallacy because you're claiming that because I believe something to be true, therefore, then you can have that same belief as well. That's how you can account for yours. The way I account for mine is not the way you account for yours.
What? So you gave a justification. You said the way you account for God is because he has existed forever outside of space-time. And the way I account for reality is because it's existed forever outside of space-time. How are those not the same?
Because they're not. Because I just explained to you. The problem is you just don't like the response. I explained to you how I can account for example, the laws of logic. Because the laws of logic are invariant, they're universal, they're matchless. I can account for these things because God is universal.
None of that.
God is invariant, God is matchless. You can't account for that because your worldview can't account for universals, invariants, or anything that's matchless.
Sonny, I never said any of that. I said you account for God by saying he has existed forever outside of space-time. I said I account for reality because because it has existed forever outside of space-time. In that statement, nothing else. You don't get to appeal to other arguments here. In that statement, what is the difference? Why are those not the same?
Because I'm justifying my worldview. You're not. You just keep saying, well, that's just reality. That's just reality. And therefore, if you believe that, therefore I can believe this also. No, that doesn't work that way. You actually have to provide you haven't even explained what an ultimate standard is. You haven't even explained what your metaphysics is. All you keep doing is rambling. You haven't provided any justifiable explanation for anything.
I have actually. I've literally provided all of that. You just don't understand it because I don't think you understand how the terms work in philosophy. So again, if you provide a justification, say you account for God in way X, then I also get to use way X to justify my worldview too. So if you use it and you think that method works, then I also get to use that method and it also works for me. If either it works for both of us or it works for neither of us. So if you can account for God by saying he's outside of space-time and existed forever, then I can account for reality by saying it's existed outside of space-time and existed forever. That's actually the consensus in physics among pretty much every physicist.
Well, if that's the case then, but if that's the case then please explain then, again, I know it's your time to ask a question, but I'd like you to please explain then how the so-called atheistic worldview can account for the universal, invariant, and matchless laws of logic. Notice how I brought those three.
Yes, I did that in the beginning. I said reality is reality. That's
reality is reality. Oh, therefore, I can account for universals, invariants, and matchless. Really?
Yes.
You don't think that smacks of assumption and being
what is
arbitrary?
The first law of logic?
Pardon?
Sonny, what is the first law of logic?
The law of identity.
Which is?
For a statement to be true, it must be true. A true statement cannot be true and not true at the same time.
That's the law of non-contradiction. The thing can be cannot be.
The law of identity states for a statement to be true, it must be true. A true statement cannot be true and not true at the same time. The law of identity states either a statement's going to be true or it's going to be false, and the law of non-contradiction.
So the law of identity is A equals A. A thing is itself. That's the law of identity.
That's exactly what I said. For a statement to be true, it must be true.
You said
what part of that didn't you understand?
What you said was a thing cannot be true and not true at the same time.
For a statement to be true, it must be true. What part of that didn't you understand? And then I said a true statement cannot be true and not true at the same time.
That's the law of non-contradiction. So that's not the first
I'm just elaborating on what the law of identity is.
So the law of identity is A equals A. A thing is itself.
That's exactly what I said.
So if I say reality is reality, what does that sound like to you?
Well, again, I agree with that statement, but the problem is I can justify that your worldview can't.
So the first law of logic is a thing is itself.
Sure.
And I said reality is reality. Do those things sound similar to you?
No, but here's the problem. Notice how you keep running from universals. Notice how no. I agree with that statement. I agree with what the law of identity states.
Okay, so my question was, Sonny, let's go back to my question.
Sure.
So the question was, the law of identity is A equals A.
Sure.
And what I said was reality is reality. Do those things sound similar?
Well, yes, but there's the but. Here's the but. You can't explain how the laws of logic, how they're universal, invariant, or matchless, how your worldview can account for them. You haven't even remotely tried.
So let's go. If reality is reality, and reality is always reality everywhere in reality, that means the law of logic, A equals A, is universal in reality, right?
How does your worldview account for that? How does your worldview account for universals? This is the ultimate issue.
That's
Your
what
job today is
that's
to
what I'm answering.
prove-
That's literally what I'm answering, Sonny. So
What's that?
if reality is reality everywhere, if everywhere at all times,
Mhm.
reality is always reality,
Mhm.
and that's the law of identity. That's the first law of logic.
Mhm.
Does that mean that logic is universal in reality?
The laws of logic are universal, yes.
No,
It's
no,
only the
I'm
Christian
asking
worldview can
in my
account for
worldview.
that.
So in my worldview, reality is reality. Reality is always reality at every point in reality. It's never not reality. That means that A equals A, the first law of logic,
Sure,
is universal.
sure.
So my worldview can account for logic as universal.
Merely citing it doesn't justify your position. You're going to have to explain how does your worldview account for universals.
All right, 1 minute left, guys.
If reality is reality,
Notice how I can appeal to God and I can say God is universal, God is invariant, God is not made of matter. Notice how I can account for the laws of logic, but notice how your worldview can't. How does your worldview count when you believe that we were once a chemical accident or protoplasms or atoms banging around? Then somehow nothing evolves into something which becomes everything. How does that account for universals and the invariant and the
well, there is never nothing. So
arguments?
that's not a position. No atheist believes that there is a literal philosophical nothing. So that's not a thing we believe. But remember, what you said was you appealed to God because
Yes.
God is everywhere and outside of space-time.
Yes.
And I said I appeal to reality, and reality is everywhere. So,
Okay.
reality is always reality
You
everywhere.
keep saying reality, but you haven't even defined what reality is. Sorry, but a worldview that denies the existence of God is not reality. That's called fiction.
Reality is all that exists.
Yes, but who do you
So
think
I
created
have-
all
so
these
I have
things?
defined
How do you
reality.
think
Like you
you're
said, I
able to
didn't define
comprehend the world
reality.
around you?
Time's up, gentlemen. Tom.
One sec, I've got to close my window. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
I thought we may have a visit from my cat, at least from one of them. Usually, if I'm sitting in this chair, she has to jump up in here.
Sorry about that. All right,
That's
I'm
all right.
back.
Okay. All right. Sonny, you'll have 25 minutes to question Tom now, and we're going to begin this right now.
All right. In regards to metaphysics, Tom, could you tell me a little bit about where do we come from and who created us?
Well, no one created us. We are a result of natural, unguided processes of matter and energy.
Matter and energy. Okay.
Yes.
So what do you appeal to justify that belief?
What do you mean by appeal to justify?
Where did you come up with that argument from?
How did I come to that belief, essentially? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
So through evidence and argument. So we start with I exist. So I think, therefore I am. I exist. And then there's some difference between my imagination and reality. I can tell that when I imagine a unicorn, I can't touch it. So we need some method to differentiate the imaginary things from the real things. That method is science. And so we say we apply science to differentiate the imaginary things and the real things. And we test, well, what knocked over that cup? Was it a squirrel? Was it the wind? Was it a leprechaun, a unicorn, a god? We say, well, if my hypothesis is a real thing, then I should be able to make predictions. I could say, if it's a squirrel, then I should find squirrel droppings around the cup. And that's a good way to tell that that hypothesis is the real one, not the imaginary one. We apply that same method to the universe. We say, well, what is the evidence of how the universe came to exist? Well, it's the Big Bang. The Big Bang is supported by the cosmic microwave background, which we do testable predictions for, and Einstein's general relativity, which we show gravity can bend and light light bends around the sun at a certain rate, and the perihelion of Mercury, and gravitational waves, and the Large Hadron Collider. We have all these different kinds of things that indicate that the physical model that predicts the universe is the correct one, and that theistic ones have never made predictions. So if we look at the cup and the squirrels, we make the prediction that they're going to be squirrel droppings, and we find squirrel droppings, that's the correct explanation. If we think it's a leprechaun and we find no fairy dust or leprechaun dust around it, that's not the correct explanation. So the correct explanation for where we came from is the naturalistic hypothesis of physics, because it's the one that makes testable predictions to show it's not imaginary. Not the God hypothesis, because it's shown no way to show it's not imaginary, so it's probably imaginary.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and essentially, I noticed you say a few times, I think. So if we were just a chemical accident that just happened by dumb luck, then are you basically just saying that when you think, you're not actually thinking, that's just a chemical reaction that fires along the synapses of your brain, which doesn't actually produce a thought, but more of a brain fart? How does that make you feel in your worldview?
Thinking is a process, so there has to be a process to do thinking. And so if the process is chemical, then it's no difference than if the process is supernatural. They're still both processes. So I don't think you think about thinking correctly. Thinking is a process.
Yeah, but I can account for thinking. You can't. So when you think about something, you have to appeal to your reasoning and your senses, right?
No, thinking is just an experience, so you don't have to. But normally you would appeal to evidence, yes.
Okay, so when you look at evidence, right? So when you take a look at the evidence to come away with your hypothesis about the naturalistic worldview as opposed to the supernaturalistic worldview, please tell me though, how do you know your presuppositions or your reasoning and your senses are true?
I don't have any presuppositions. I know my reasoning is true because I can say, I can't believe I exist and be wrong. Therefore, I have one true belief.
Okay, but you didn't answer my question. How do you know it's true?
Because I can't believe I exist and be wrong.
What are you? What are you appealing to? What are you appealing to justify that? Is what I'm asking you.
Reality.
Okay, that begs the question again. You're assuming. I'm asking
How does that
you
beg
to provide.
the
I'm
question?
asking you to provide.
What did I assume?
How do you know your reasoning and your senses are valid? What's to say if somebody right now comes here right now, I ask them the same question, but they give me a totally different conclusion? That means one of you is right and the other one is wrong. How do you justify your position?
If someone says they don't exist, how do I know they're wrong?
No, I'm asking you, how do you know your senses and your reasoning are valid? You're coming away with an assumption that is not
so my reasoning cannot be
accepted.
wrong. So my reasoning has to be right. If I think I exist, then I have to exist because I can't be thinking and not exist. So I know my reasoning is correct.
Okay, that
can't be wrong.
That doesn't prove it's correct. I just said
that's literally what it does. That's literally
why is it?
Correct.
But why is it today? When if I were to answer that same question, I'm not going to come away with the same answer, nor is any other professing Christian, but you come away with the idea that when you appeal to your reasoning and your senses to know that the hypothesis of naturalistic evolution per se is true, that's what I'm asking you. How do you know what you're saying right now is true?
So I know my reasoning is true because I cannot think I exist and be wrong. It's not possible for that to be the case because that would mean that reality was not reality. So I know my reasoning is correct. There's some parts of my reasoning that must be correct. I have now justified reasoning. And then I can use that reasoning to do other things like, oh, there's some difference between my imagination and my experience. And we have to figure out, using my reasoning that I know is correct because I can't think I exist and be wrong, I have to come up with a method to differentiate the imaginary things and the real things. And then with that method, I can apply it to other things like, well, what created the universe? What is the ontology and metaphysics of the universe? And we can test those hypotheses to see which one is the most reasonable to believe. So we start with our reasoning, which we know is correct because I can't think I exist to be wrong, and then we build off of that to understand, apply those methods.
Okay, yeah, you're not answering my question. Let me go to the next question real quick. So now that I have a little bit about your explanation about metaphysics, so in other words, you just believe inert matter, become a cognizant creature that can love, apply, and have logic and morals, which again is another belief based on fiction and not fact. But let's continue to move on real quick. Well, what is your worldview? How would you define your worldview?
Naturalism, materialism.
Okay, so go a little bit more in depth with me a little bit. What comprises a worldview?
The fundamental nature of reality, or the facts that comprise whatever you think is the fundamental nature of reality.
Whatever you think. So if I think right now, if somebody can think right now that whatever, they can just make up every imaginary device possible, and as long as they think it, therefore it's true?
No, a worldview is your belief. So you can have false beliefs, like you can
Yes.
believe in a god that doesn't exist, who made a magical rib woman who was convinced by a talking snake.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean it's true. So a worldview is just your beliefs. It doesn't mean it's true.
Okay. So your worldview makes up your beliefs, but be a little bit more specific. What's comprised in that? Like, would you agree with me if I say metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics comprise a worldview?
No, a worldview is just what you think the fundamental nature of reality is, and depending on the kind of worldview you have, it can have those three things and other things in it, but it doesn't require those three things. No.
Okay. So would you agree with me if I say then that when you presuppose an argument that it's from your worldview, you presuppose what your worldview is? Would you agree with that statement?
No, because arguments don't necessarily have anything to do with your worldview.
Really?
And you don't need to presuppose anything for arguments.
Really? You're telling me right
Yes.
now that you don't presuppose what your worldview is? How is that possible when everything you've said today is presupposing a naturalistic
No, it's a
worldview?
straw
And
man.
everything
So
I'm
I presuppose
presupposing
nothing.
is based on a Christian worldview.
Sonny, what is a presupposition?
Well, a presupposition is you are basic. Well, actually, it's my turn to ask you a question. So go ahead.
Well, you asked me like how does my worldview account for these things while presupposing? So I need to know what you mean by presupposing.
Yeah, well, presupposing exactly how I used it. You're presupposing something to be true. You're making an argument based on your worldview. Whatever your worldview is.
A presupposition, just to clarify, a presupposition is a belief that you assume is true before you make the argument, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so I didn't make any of those in my argument. My argument was I think therefore I am. Like, what is the presupposition in that?
Okay. Well, everything is everything is presupposed, whether you want to agree with it or not. But let me continue. Here's another question I wanted to ask you then. In regards to your worldview, so when you make the argument that your worldview is based upon a naturalistic worldview, I'd like to know a little bit more about a standard. What is your?
Just to clarify, it's not based on a
ultimate
naturalistic
standard?
worldview. It's not based. So the naturalistic worldview is a conclusion based off of evidence. So it's not. I don't assume that that's the conclusion.
Okay. Well, that's an assumption. So what is your ultimate standard?
Reality.
Your ultimate standard is reality. Could you define reality for me?
All that exists.
All that exists. Okay. So when somebody asks you right now, where do you derive all your beliefs from? You just say it's reality, whatever reality is. Don't you think that's circular? Hey, what's your belief? It's reality, and where does it end? Then it's just reality. Then your conclusion is just a reinstatement of the premise. Well, that's what I'm trying to get a little bit from you. What is your ultimate standard that you're appealing to?
Reality.
Reality. Okay, so you're just making an arbitrary statement now.
How is that an arbitrary statement?
Because you haven't defined what reality means. You just keep saying reality.
No, I literally did. You literally asked, like, what is reality?
Your view of reality is not the same as mine. You believe in naturalism. I believe in a supernaturalistic worldview. So your view of reality is flawed, fundamentally flawed, philosophically illiterate.
So you said I didn't define reality right after I gave a definition of reality. So my fundamental standard is reality. I define reality as all that exists. If the supernatural exists, that would be in reality. If God exists, he would be in reality. There's no evidence to conclude he does, but but I define my ultimate standard is reality.
Okay. Can your view of reality, can your ultimate standard of reality account for the validity of strict principles, meaning universals, invariant, and matchless? Please explain.
Yes.
Please explain.
Reality is reality everywhere, universally, at all times, in all spaces. Reality is always reality. Reality can never not be reality.
How can your view of professing atheism account for that when clearly think about something, okay? And I want you to hear me out on this, okay? If I just asked you a minute ago, can the worldview that you hold to account, or your view of reality account for the invariant, universal, and abstract principles, strict principles of validity, then I'd like to know then, how in your worldview do you account for the invariant, meaning it doesn't change? How do you have that when you believe that you were once a chemical accident that happened 1 billion years ago, and now you are basically a human being that can apply logic, and have morals? How do you believe that? How can your worldview account for that?
Well, there's a bunch of different parts to that question. So how do I account for the universal, unchanging laws of logic? Well, because reality is reality, always, forever. That gives me
You're not
a universal.
answering the question. You're running again as usual. Let me try this again one more time. I'm going to try and explain it in the most basic common sense way, okay? So I'm going to explain this, and I want you to pay attention this time, and I want you to give a nice, cogent response to it. So here we go. I believe in the Christian worldview. I believe that God is universal, God is invariant, God is not made of matter, and God is not affected by time, space, or people.
Could you say that again? Slow.
Okay. I believe
I'm
God is.
I'm typing these down. Okay, go.
I believe God is universal.
Universal.
I believe God is invariant.
Invariant.
And I believe God is not made of matter.
God is not made of matter.
This is how I can account for the laws of logic, because guess what? The laws of logic don't change. The laws of logic do not apply. The laws of logic apply everywhere, and the laws of logic, you cannot touch them. But here's the fundamental problem in your worldview, young man, is the fact of your worldview. Atheism clearly changes, and it's not invariant because you believe in naturalistic evolution. You believe we were a chemical accident. You believe inert matter became a cognizant creature. That's the problem. So you can't say that your worldview accounts for the invariance. Think about universals. Universal means it applies everywhere. Well, how can that be? How can you apply everywhere if you believe that basically by chance and dumb luck, then we can eventually, or that we were once formed in some primordial soup when we eventually became, human beings. Again, so you can't account for the universals. And of course, we're talking about the conceptual part. You keep appealing to science and you keep making arguments about science, but you can't observe the concept of logic because you can't physically touch it. You have to apply logic. So that's what I'm trying to ask you right now. How do you account for the universal, abstract, and matchless laws of logic in a worldview that rejects these principles?
It doesn't. Like every atheist accepts these principles. Reality is reality everywhere at all times, universally. It's not made of matter. It accounts for everything in the universe. It's always reality. Is always going to be reality. So just take your God argument, replace God with reality. You get atheism. So you don't need the God. Just get rid of the mind stuff. You get just reality is reality, and then it counts for all the laws of logic just fine. And then how did we go from matter to mind? It's called emergent properties. Like wetness did not exist at the early universe. Wetness came about because hydrogen molecules and oxygen molecules bound together with a weak bond that can now create wetness. The wetness didn't always exist. You didn't always need it. You didn't need. God does not need to be wet to create wetness. He created other things, and those other things produce wetness. The mind is the same. You can have a reality made of matter, and the matter can combine in different ways to produce consciousness. The thing that created doesn't need to be conscious.
You're not answering my question. You're just babbling now. You're not even remotely touching my question.
So your question is how did we go from matter to mind? How we went from matter to mind.
How do you account for these things in your worldview that rejects them?
So account is how did it happen, right? That's to give an account.
How does a worldview that clearly that if you when I asked you earlier about your view of metaphysics, you explained to me a naturalistic view of evolution. Okay, yes. You explained to me that we're basically a chemical accident is what happened, right? You basically explained. So how does a chemical accident or inert matter become a cognizant creature? And you can make the argument today that you can account for the invariant, universal, abstract laws of logic.
That's a different question. So there's two questions there. How do I account for the invariant, universal laws of logic? I do that by saying reality is reality. That gives me an account for the universal laws of logic accepted by everyone in philosophy.
But you just admitted, you shook your head yes when I asked you about your worldview. How do you derive from that fundamentally stands against it?
The next question is, how do we get from matter to mind? How we get from matter to mind is there are these things called emergent properties. So if you put enough bricks together, you get a wall. But no brick has the property of walls. But somehow, if you add them together, you get a wall. And so what this is called an emergent property. That means things that don't have something, if they're added together in a certain way, can make a new property that none of the parts have. Composition division fallacy, it means that if you put all the parts together, you can make something new that none of the parts ever had before. So if you have matter and you put it together in a certain way, it can produce consciousness even though none of the matter ever had the consciousness. Just like if you put bricks together, you can build a wall even though none of the bricks have the property of a wall. So emergent properties are like the sun. The sun is an emergent property of hydrogen and helium, which none of them are a star. No amount of just a single atom of hydrogen or helium is a star.
You're absolutely running from the question again. I have what you're saying right now has absolutely nothing to do with the question. Nothing.
Well, you had two questions.
Not
One
a
is, how do
single
I account
thing.
for the universals of logic, which reality is reality. That's how I do it. You had a second question, which was, how do we go from matter to mind, which is emergent properties. I literally answered both of those.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. How do you openly admit that we were inert matter, that we become a human being, a cognizant human creature? That's not invariant. That rejects invariance. That clearly rejects universals. How can you account for the laws of logic when your worldview denies it?
So some things can be universal. That doesn't mean everything needs to be universal. It's not like you need a universe that is just an unchanging brick because there are universals. There are some things that are universal. Other things are not universal. This should not be hard. So the law of logic is universal. Reality is reality. The things in reality, like physics, can change.
Oh, okay. Laws of logic, would you agree with me if I say the laws of logic are always true? They apply everywhere, and they're not affected by time,
Yes.
space, matter, or people.
Yes.
Okay.
Reality is reality.
Think about how you just contradicted yourself. If the laws of logic are always true, they apply everywhere, they're not affected by time, space, or matter, well then please again go back to when you said by which you believe you were derived. You believe nothing basically becomes something. If you believe a chemical accident,
I never said that.
I'll use your terms. Inert matter became a cognizant creature. How is that invariant, and how can that apply, or how can that account for universals? Please tell me that.
Okay, so you can have some things that are universal, but that doesn't mean everything is universal.
But the laws of logic are always true. Laws of logic apply everywhere. The laws of logic are not affected by time, space, or matter. That's universals in there. Again, you're contradicting yourself.
How is that a contradiction?
Because if you admit that the laws of logic apply everywhere and they're always true, well then how come that wasn't the case when you believed by which you were derived, when you believed inert matter became a cognizant creature?
Why would that not be true? Why would that not be true then? That would still be true.
Because logic doesn't change. Clearly, you believe that you had a radical change that you believe inert matter became a cognizant creature.
That's not breaking the laws of logic. Why do you think that's breaking the laws of logic?
How is it not? That's like saying right now that a brick can turn itself into a human being. How can a brick turn itself into a human being? Because I know that the laws of logic, that brick is always going to be a brick. It's not going to be a brick and not going to be a brick at the same time. And two things cannot both be right or wrong at the same time. So that's how I know.
I think I understand your argument. I think your argument is that if matter is non-conscious and everything in the universe is matter and it's not conscious, then it would be a violation of the laws of logic for matter to combine in a way to produce consciousness because it was never there before. Is that what you're saying?
Similar.
That is a composition division fallacy. It is philosophy 101. You can have things that have no property combine in a way to produce a new property. This is called an emergent property. No brick has a wall, but when you put bricks together, you get a wall. Did that break the laws of logic?
No, but did that brick become a human being? That's the problem with your worldview.
No,
your worldview
that's
believes
the same
inert
thing.
matter
So
became
I'm
a
trying to
cognizant
simplify
creature.
it for you to make it easier for you to understand. We can use the example of bricks and walls. No brick has the property of walls, but when you put bricks together, you build a wall that isn't violating the laws of logic for this same reason that when you take matter and you put it together to build a conscious brain, it also isn't breaking the laws of logic because they're doing the same thing. You have an emergent property, which is a combination of smaller things which don't have the property, but when you put them together, you get a new property that none of the smaller things had before. This is called emergent properties. Another example is like the sun. The sun is a bunch of hydrogen and helium atoms. None of those are a star. None of those can bend space-time to cause things to orbit around them. But if you add enough together, you get a star. So you can have these things called emergent properties, which are new properties that didn't exist in any of the parts. And there's no violation of logic in that. That's perfectly coherent.
Yeah.
So saying
in your worldview, that's what you've misled yourself to believe, or you're just being philosophically. You're being dishonest, is what you're doing.
So walls can't come from bricks?
No, that's not the point. I'm saying a brick cannot become a human being the same way inert matter is not going to become a cognizant creature that can evolve itself into being a human being that can love, apply logic, and have morals. And that's the problem. You just keep. Let me move on to the next question then. So in regards to the topic of universals, let's get to the topic of universals. Tell me real quick about your view of universals. How does atheism account for universals?
Reality is reality. That's universal.
Is that your argument for everything I ask now? Reality is reality. It's just reality, therefore it's true.
Well, that's your argument for everything. Is like, well, why is reality reality? God is your answer for everything. I mean, it's the same thing. Just take your God argument, replace the God with reality, and you get a naturalistic worldview. So everything about reality, everything about the universals, everything about logic and math is all grounded in one thing, which is reality.
Do you believe universals? Do you believe universal, the concept of universals, that it's always true and it applies everywhere?
That reality is reality. Yes.
Okay. So give me an example of a universal.
Reality is reality.
No, give me, because let's get away from the reality art. Give me an example of a universal concept.
A equals A.
Pardon?
A equals A.
Okay, good. So A equals A. We know that's a universal argument. So tomorrow, if we travel to China, that A is always going to be an A. It's not going to evolve itself into something else.
Yes.
Right? Okay. So has A always been A?
Yes.
Okay. But what's the problem? Don't you see the problem with your worldview?
Where what problem? I don't see any problem.
Because you said A always is A.
Yes.
You can't say in your worldview that a human being has always been a human being in your worldview because you believe you were once inert matter that became a cognizant creature. Don't you see the problem?
No. Again, I explained that that's the composition division fallacy. So you can take things like bricks and you can add them together to get a new property that never existed. So there was never a wall. Walls never existed 20 million years ago. But if people existed and they built these things called walls, did they break the laws of logic? No. Things can change over time, but the laws of logic don't change. The laws of logic do not mean things cannot change. They don't work that way.
Okay, so here's another question for you. Just out of curiosity, do you know for a fact that God does not exist?
Some of them, yes, not all of them. So I think the Christian God, yes, you can know what the fact does not exist. Other gods, not so much.
Okay, so let me get this clear. So you don't believe that the all-knowing and infinite God does not exist. Wouldn't that mean you have to have all knowledge to have examined every single particle in the universe to make such a claim? Don't you think that's a little self-refuting since you don't believe in an all-knowing God that exists?
No, all I have to do is know that it's a contradiction. So if you ask me, does a round square exist? Well, no, that can't exist because the laws of logic are universal. They exist everywhere in reality. So if you ask me if does something that is both itself and not itself exist, I can say, well, no, I can know for certain that doesn't exist because it entails a contradiction and violates the laws of logic.
Okay.
The Christian God violates the laws of logic because it is contradictory properties.
Well, out of curiosity, then, if you know God does not exist, why do you spend so much time trying to debate
1 minute,
it online?
Sonny.
Huh?
1 minute.
Okay. If you know for a fact that God does not exist, then why do you try to debate it so much? Now, clearly, you know that Santa or the Easter Bunny doesn't exist, but you're not trying to debate whether or not they exist. Why do you debate so much that God doesn't exist?
Because it's a popular topic. So it's a popular topic that many people believe that is easy to debunk and refute and show how to correctly establish epistemology and show which arguments are wrong and which arguments are right. And so it's a great resource to use as an example to illustrate correct and incorrect thinking by illustrating fallacies in religious thinking. So it's a very common belief. That's why it's...
But the problem is by making that statement, you haven't proved that God doesn't exist. You're just proving you don't like him. So you're going to continue to suppress the truth. And that's why my prayer is that God will open your eyes, he'll deliver you from your absurdity, and show you that the perfect righteousness of Christ is your only hope. Because at this point, when you stand before the tribunal of God, all this money and all these people that support you are not going to be able to help you on that great day.
I'll ask him about the magical rib woman and the talking snake thing. I think that'll be a fun conversation.
Okay, time's up, gentlemen.